Hello, and welcome to the Psychology of Us with me, Professor RJ Starr. It's great to have you here. Today, we're diving into something I think just about everyone can relate to, overthinking. You know, that mental hamster wheel where one thought leads to another, and before you know it, you're analyzing something that happened years ago, or trying to predict every possible outcome of something that hasn't even happened yet. I want to start by saying this. Overthinking is something we've all experienced at some point. It's universal, it's frustrating, and it's exhausting. But here's the good news. It's also something we can understand, unpack, and begin to manage. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty, I want to share a quick story. A while back, I had to write an important email. It wasn't a long email, just a few sentences really, but it felt significant because the stakes were high. I must have written and rewritten that email a dozen times. I'd send it to myself to see how it looked in my inbox, and then I'd tweak it again. At one point, I even thought about scrapping it altogether because I couldn't get the wording just right. And here's the kicker. When I finally hit send, the response I got was a simple, "Sounds great." And all that worry, all that overthinking, and it turned out to be a complete non-issue. Sound familiar? That spiral of doubt and second guessing? If it does, you're not alone. Overthinking is incredibly common, but it's also uniquely personal. It can show up in different ways for different people. Whether it's replaying conversations in your head, trying to plan for every possible outcome of a situation, or even something as seemingly simple as deciding what to order at a restaurant. What's fascinating is that overthinking doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's deeply tied to how our brains are wired and influenced by our individual experiences. Not a flaw, it's not a weakness. It's often the result of our brain trying to protect us, trying to solve problems, or trying to make sense of uncertainty. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at the psychology of overthinking. We'll explore why it happens, how it impacts us, and most importantly, how we can begin to break free from its grip. Along the way, I'll share insights from psychological research, a case study or two, and maybe even a few more personal stories. So whether you're someone who tends to overanalyze everything, or you're just curious about why our minds work the way they do, I think you'll find something valuable here. And as always, I encourage you to listen not just with curiosity, but with compassion for yourself and for others. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Let's start with a question. What exactly is overthinking? Most of us know what it feels like, but defining it can be tricky. At its core, overthinking is a mental habit where we dwell excessively on problems, decisions, or uncertainties. It often takes two forms. The first one is rumination, which focuses on the past, replaying old conversations, rehashing mistakes, or wondering what you could have done differently. The second is worry, which is future-oriented, running through endless what-ifs or imagining worst-case scenarios. Have you ever drafted a text message, rewritten it 3 times, and then debated whether to send it at all? Maybe you were worried about how the other person would interpret it, or you overanalyze your own tone. By the time you finally hit send, or didn't, you'd spent more mental energy on that one text than it probably deserved. That is overthinking in action. Excuse me. What's fascinating about overthinking, you see, is that it often feels productive even when it's not. It tricks us into believing that if we just think a little bit harder, a little bit longer, we'll find the perfect solution or avoid making a mistake. But here's the catch. Overthinking doesn't usually lead to clarity or resolution. Instead, it creates mental fog and emotional exhaustion. From a psychological perspective, overthinking is closely tied to something called the negativity bias. This is a well-documented tendency for our brains to focus more on negative experiences or possibilities than positive ones. Why? Well, because from an evolutionary standpoint, paying attention to threats, real or imagined, helped our ancestors survive. And if you were constantly scanning for danger, you are more likely to avoid predators or other risks. The problem is, in our modern world, this survival mechanism often gets misapplied. Instead of protecting us, it keeps us stuck in cycles of doubt and worry. There's another concept worth mentioning here: metacognition, or thinking about your thinking. On the surface, it sounds like a good thing. After all, self-awareness is key to personal growth. But when metacognition turns into overthinking, it becomes a trap. Instead of simply noticing your thoughts, you start analyzing them, judging them, and getting lost in them. Let me share a story to illustrate this. A former student of mine, let's call her Emily, came to me during office hours one day. She was struggling with a decision about whether to change her major. She loved psychology, but worried about job prospects, not too uncommon in the psychology world. On the other hand, her parents were pushing her toward business, which she found uninteresting, but practical. Emily had spent weeks researching, making pros and cons lists, and asking for advice, but still she couldn't decide. She said to me, "I feel like I'm thinking about this all the time, but I'm getting nowhere." Emily's experience is a classic example of overthinking. Her brain was working overtime trying to make the right decision, but the constant analysis was actually paralyzing her. This is something we'll talk about more in the next segment: why overthinking happens and how it ties to deeper psychological patterns. You may have even heard the expression analysis paralysis. But before we get into that, for now, I want to leave you with this thought. Overthinking is not a sign of weakness or failure. It's a natural response to uncertainty and stress. But like any habit, it can be understood, managed, and transformed. Let's move on to explore why we overthink and what's really driving this mental cycle. So, why do we overthink? What's really happening in our minds when we find ourselves stuck in those endless loops of rumination and worry? To answer that, we need to look at both our evolutionary history and the psychological patterns we've developed as individuals. Let's start with evolution. Imagine for a moment that you're living thousands of years ago as part of an early human community. Your survival depends on being hyper-aware of potential threats, whether it's a predator hiding in the bushes or a rival tribe encroaching on your territory. In that environment, overthinking could actually be useful. It might help you anticipate danger, plan your next move, or avoid a risky situation altogether. But fast forward to today, and most of us don't face those same life or death scenarios. Yet our brains are still wired to scan for threats. Instead of worrying about predators, we worry about sending an awkward email or making a less than perfect impression at a party. The same mental mechanisms that once kept us alive can now leave us feeling stuck and overwhelmed. Of course, evolution is only a part of the story. Overthinking is also shaped by individual experiences, personality traits, and cultural influences. One major factor is the illusion of control. Many of us overthink because we believe, on some level, that if we just think hard enough, we can control the outcome of any situation. It's a comforting thought, but it's not always realistic. And here's where things get interesting. Research shows that people who struggle with anxiety or perfectionism are particularly prone to overthinking. Anxiety amplifies our tendency to imagine worst-case scenarios, while perfectionism convinces us that every decision has to be flawless. These traits create fertile ground for overthinking to take root. Here's a case study that will bring this to life. A client that I called James came to me with what he described as decision paralysis. He was in his late 20s and had been offered a promotion at work. On the surface, it should have been great news. It was a chance to advance his career and earn more money. But James could not stop overthinking the decision. He worried that taking the promotion would mean longer hours and less time for his hobbies. At the same time, he feared that turning it down would make him seem unambitious. For weeks, he replayed the pros and cons in his head, losing sleep and second-guessing himself at every turn. James' overthinking wasn't really about the promotion itself. It was about deeper fears. Fear of failure, fear of making the wrong choice, and fear of how others might perceive him. This is one of the key drivers of overthinking, our emotions. While it might feel like overthinking is purely logical, it's often fueled by unresolved feelings like fear, guilt, or uncertainty. Another layer to consider here is the role of societal pressure. We live in a world that glorifies productivity, success, and certainty. From a young age, we're taught to believe that we need to have all the answers. But life is rarely that simple. Overthinking can become a way of coping with the discomfort of not knowing, of feeling vulnerable or out of control. Carl Jung, one of the most influential thinkers in psychology, is quoted as saying, "What you resist persists." When we try to resist uncertainty or push away uncomfortable feelings, they tend to stick around, and overthinking is often the result. Instead of facing our fears head on, we get caught in mental loops, hoping that the answers will magically appear if we just keep thinking. So why do we overthink? Well, it feels safer, actually, than sitting with uncertainty, because we're wired to solve problems even when there's no clear solution. And because in some ways, it's easier to stay in our heads than to take action or face the unknown. The good news is that understanding why we overthink is the first step toward breaking free from it. Once we recognize the patterns and the emotions driving our overthinking, we can start to shift our relationship with our thoughts.
Have you ever stopped to consider the stories that shape your life? The quiet narratives running through the mind, defining identity, influencing relationships, and framing the way the world is perceived? In The Stories We Tell Ourselves, How Personal Narratives Shape Your Life, Professor RJ Starr explores the profound impact of these internal narratives. Drawing on psychology, real-life case studies, and personal anecdotes, this book examines how the stories people inherit, create, and believe can either limit them or set them free. More than just an exploration of personal narratives, The Stories We Tell Ourselves offers practical tools for reshaping the stories that no longer serve a purpose. With insight and compassion, Starr provides a roadmap for transforming self-limiting beliefs into narratives of empowerment, authenticity, and meaning. For anyone who has ever felt stuck, uncertain of their identity, or ready to embrace a new chapter, this book serves as an invitation to reclaim their story and step into a life of greater clarity and purpose. The Stories We Tell Ourselves, How Personal Narratives Shape Your Life, is available now online and in bookstores.
But getting back to the cost of overthinking, let's talk about what it takes from us emotionally, mentally, and even physically. Because while it may feel like overthinking keeps us safe or prepared, it actually has some significant downsides. First, let's look at the emotional toll. Overthinking often leaves us feeling anxious, stressed, stuck. It's as though our minds are running a marathon, but we're not getting anywhere. And that kind of mental spinning can lead to exhaustion. When you're caught up in the worry trap, it's hard to fully relax or enjoy the moment. You might find yourself lying in bed, begging to go to sleep, replaying conversations, or agonizing over decisions. And sleep, as we know, isn't just a luxury, it's essential for emotional regulation. When we're sleep deprived, we're more likely to feel irritable, overwhelmed, and reactive. So overthinking doesn't just make us tired, it can create a vicious cycle where our lack of rest fuels even more rumination. Then there's the cognitive cost. Overthinking can actually impair our ability to focus and solve problems. When your brain is busy analyzing every possible outcome, It's harder to think creatively or make decisions with confidence. It's like trying to solve a puzzle while someone keeps dumping more pieces of puzzle on the table. I once worked with a colleague, let's call her Maya, described her feeling like her brain was too full. She was juggling multiple projects and found herself overthinking even small decisions, like what font to use in a presentation. Maya's overthinking wasn't just slowing her down, it was making her doubt her own abilities. A brilliant, brilliant mind. This is something I see often. Overthinking erodes self-trust. The more we question ourselves, the harder it becomes to act with confidence. But the impact of overthinking doesn't stop with us. It can also affect our relationships. Think about it. If you're constantly second guessing what someone said or analyzing their tone, it's easy to misinterpret their intentions. Overthinking can make us hypersensitive to perceived slights or create unnecessary conflict. Let me share an example. A close friend of mine, let's call him David, once got into an argument with his partner over a simple text message. The message said, "Sure, whatever works," and David spent the entire afternoon wondering if the tone was dismissive or annoyed. By the time he saw his partner that evening, he was so convinced that something was wrong that he brought it up, only to find out that there was no issue at all. David's overthinking had created a problem where there wasn't one, straining their connection for no reason. Studies have shown that overthinking can make us less present in our interactions with others. Instead of really listening or connecting, we're stuck in our heads, replaying past conversations, or planning what to say next. And this can leave us feeling isolated and misunderstood, even in close relationships. And last, we need to acknowledge the physical impact of overthinking. Chronic stress, fueled by constant rumination, can take a toll on the body. It's linked to headaches, digestive issues, and even weakened immune function. Overthinking might feel like it's happening in your head, but its effects are felt throughout your entire system. So what's the real cost of overthinking? It drains our energy, clouds our thinking, strains our relationships, and impacts our physical health. It robs us of the joy and peace that come from living in the moment. The good news is, my friends, that there are ways to break free from the cycle. So now let's explore some strategies to help you manage overthinking and build a healthier relationship with your mind. Let's shift our focus from the problem to the solutions. How do you break free from the worry trap? Because while overthinking can feel overwhelming, it's not a life sentence. With some awareness and practice, we can learn to navigate our thoughts more effectively. One of the first steps is to recognize your overthinking patterns. When you catch yourself spiraling, pause and ask, what am I really worried about? Is this thought helping me solve a problem, or is it just making me more anxious? Often, just naming what's happening, saying to yourself, I'm spinning out, I'm overthinking, can create enough distance to interrupt the cycle. I remember preparing for a big presentation early in my teaching career. I'd written my notes, practiced my delivery, it felt relatively confident. But the night before, my mind started to spiral. I kept thinking, what if I forget something? What if the audience would happen to have been all grad students? What if the audience doesn't respond well? What if I stumble all over my words? What if they see through me? I spent hours running through every possible scenario, trying to rehearse my way to perfection. But by the time morning came, I was exhausted and no closer to feeling prepared. That experience taught me a really important lesson. Overthinking often feels productive, but it rarely is. It rarely is. It's like rocking in a chair. You're moving, but you're not going anywhere. What I needed in that moment wasn't more analysis. It was a way to calm my mind and focus on the present. One strategy that can help is mindfulness. This doesn't have to mean sitting cross-legged on a cushion chanting Om, although if that works for you, go for it. Mindfulness is simply about being present. One technique I often recommend is grounding yourself in your senses. For example, take a deep breath and notice the feeling of the air filling your lungs. Pay attention to the sounds around you, the texture of whatever you're touching or sitting on, or the sensation of your feet on the ground or your body on the cushion. These small moments of awareness can help you step out of your head and get back into the present. Another powerful tool is self-compassion, a concept developed by Dr. Kristen Neff. Overthinking comes with a harsh inner critic, that voice that says, you're not doing enough, you're going to mess up. Self-compassion is about responding to that voice with kindness instead of criticism. Imagine how you'd speak to a close friend who was struggling and try offering yourself the same understanding. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, also offers some practical tools for managing overthinking. One of my favorites is thought reframing. When you catch yourself stuck in a negative thought loop, try asking, what's another way to look at this? There's an author, Byron Katie, who also poses the question, can I absolutely know that this thought is true? Who would I be without this thought? She's called the work, Byron Katie. Look her up. She's a brilliant author. For example, if you're thinking, I'll never get this right, you might reframe it as, I've learned from my mistakes before, and I can do it again. Let's revisit the case of my student James, who was paralyzed by the decision of his promotion. One exercise we worked on together was separating facts from fears. He wrote down what he knew to be true, like the specific responsibilities of the role, and then listed the fears that were clouding his judgment. This helped him see that many of his worries weren't grounded in reality, but were assumptions or what-ifs. Another strategy is to focus on taking action. Overthinking often keeps us stuck in analysis mode, analysis paralysis, where we're trying to predict the perfect outcome before we act. But sometimes the best way to gain clarity is to take a small, imperfect step. It's like driving at night. You don't need to see the entire road to move forward. You just need to see what's right in front of you. And finally, it's important to remember that breaking free from overthinking isn't about eliminating your thoughts altogether. That's impossible. And honestly, it's not the goal. The goal is to change your relationship with your thoughts. Instead of letting your thoughts control you, you learn to observe them with curiosity and choose which ones deserve your attention. Carl Rogers comes to mind. Carl Rogers was a pioneer in humanistic psychology. He talked about the importance of unconditional positive regard, the idea of accepting ourselves and others without judgment, unconditional positive regard. When we apply this principle to our own minds, it creates space for growth and change. So what can you do the next time you find yourself caught in a worry trap? Start small. Try grounding yourself in the present moment. Practice self-compassion. Challenge your negative thoughts. And most importantly, remind yourself that it's okay to not have all the answers. Life is full of uncertainty, my friends, but that's also where possibility lives. So as I wrap up, we'll talk about how to build a healthier relationship with your mind, one that allows you to embrace the present and move forward with confidence. So as we wrap up our conversation on overthinking, I want to leave you with a vision of what it could feel like to have a healthier, more compassionate relationship with your mind. Imagine waking up in the morning and noticing your thoughts without feeling weighed down by them. Imagine being able to let go of the urge to control every detail, trusting that things will unfold as they will. Building this kind of relationship with your mind isn't about silencing your thoughts or trying to become some perfectly zen version of yourself. No. It's about shifting your focus from control to curiosity, from judgment to acceptance. Let's talk about curiosity. Curiosity is one of the most powerful antidotes to overthinking. When you approach your thoughts with curiosity, you're not trying to fix them or fight them. You're simply noticing them. It's like being an observer in your own mind. You might say to yourself, oh, that's interesting. I'm really worried about this meeting today. What's going on there? This shift in perspective can make your thoughts feel less overwhelming and more manageable. Carl Rogers, the humanist psychology I spoke about earlier, believed in the transformative power of unconditional positive regard. He often applied this concept to therapy, but I think it's just as relevant to our inner lives. When you can look at your own thoughts and feelings without judgment, you create space for growth, space for change. Another way to build a healthier relationship with your mind is through gratitude, the practice of gratitude. I know gratitude gets a lot of buzz these days, but it's for good reason. When we focus on what we're thankful for, it naturally pulls us out of the cycle of overthinking and into the present moment. This doesn't mean you have to keep a detailed journal or write essays every day, though you can if that works for you, and it is quite effective. It might be as simple as pausing for a moment and saying, I'm grateful for the warmth of my coffee, or I'm thankful for the sound of rain outside. One of my favorite practices is what I call the 5-minute reset. It's a simple exercise where you take 5 minutes to sit quietly and just notice your breath. You don't need to control it or change it. You just notice it. If you feel the air coming in and out of your body, if your mind starts to wander, gently bring it back to your breath. This practice helps anchor you in the present moment and reminds you that you don't have to follow every thought that comes up. Last, I want to emphasize the importance of self-compassion. Overthinking comes often with a harsh inner dialogue, the voice that says, why can't you get it together? Or you're going to mess this up? Or, oh my God, I wish I could stop thinking. But what if instead of criticizing yourself, you offered yourself kindness? What if you said, this is hard and that's okay? Or I'm doing the best I can right now. One of my students once shared a story about a breakthrough he had while practicing self-compassion. He spent weeks overthinking a conflict with a friend, replaying the argument and questioning what he could have done differently. Finally, he decided to write a letter to himself, as if he was his own best friend. In that letter, he acknowledged his pain, validated his feelings, and reminded himself that no one is perfect. He told me that simply putting those words on paper helped quiet the storm in his mind. And that's the real power of self-compassion, my friends. It doesn't solve all your problems, but it changes how you face them. So, as you move forward, I encourage you to experiment with these practices. Be curious about your thoughts. Anchor yourself in the present. Practice gratitude and self-compassion. And most importantly, remember that you don't have to have all the answers. Life is messy and uncertain, but it's also beautiful and full of possibility. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of The Psychology of Us. I hope you found something here that resonates with you. And if you have any thoughts or questions or comments that you'd like to share with me, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.